He was a billionaire CEO who once called a black waitress illiterate. But months later, that same waitress stood tall while he sat broke, trembling, and whispering the words no one expected. "Naomi, please teach me how to read." And in that moment, a $10 billion empire was already gone.
Naomi Carter was 24 years old, working the night shift at one of the most expensive restaurants in New York. She wore a black apron that was already stained with wine drops and sauce marks. Her back ached, her feet were sore, but her spirit was steady. She had learned early that life did not care about her pain. What mattered was how long she could stand without falling. That night, the restaurant was louder than usual. Powerful men filled the room, men who made decisions that shook entire industries. Naomi knew little about them, except that the tips from their tables could pay her grandmother's medication for weeks. She smiled politely, balancing trays of champagne, moving quietly between the silk suits and glittering watches. Then, the air shifted. The chatter slowed as a man entered. Clayton Pierce, a billionaire CEO with a reputation for crushing anyone who stood in his way. His watch alone could have bought the house Naomi grew up in. He laughed too loudly, walked too proudly, and carried arrogance like a crown. His eyes swept across the room before landing on Naomi. She approached to serve, steadying her voice, steadying her shaking hands. But before she could speak, his words sliced through the room like glass. He called her illiterate. He said it as if it were a fact, not an insult. The room froze. Glasses stopped clinking, forks stopped moving. Naomi's chest tightened as her cheeks burned. The investors sitting around him looked at one another, their expressions tightening. Something heavy hung in the silence, something Clayton did not see. Naomi lowered her eyes, holding her tray steady, even as her heart threatened to crack. Across the table, one investor leaned toward another, whispering words Naomi could not hear. Their faces hardened, their eyes narrowing not at her, but at him. And in that moment, Naomi did not yet know, but Clayton Pierce's empire had just been placed on a blade's edge. Naomi Carter had not planned to be a waitress forever. She once dreamed of standing in front of a classroom, chalk in hand, teaching young children to read. She wanted to change lives the way her grandmother had changed hers. But dreams cost money, and she had none. At 19, she was accepted into college. She loved the campus, the smell of books, the sound of professors debating ideas. But in her second year, her grandmother fell ill. Naomi left school without a second thought. She took 2 jobs, then 3, paying for medicine, for rent, for food. The dream of teaching faded into the shadows. Survival came first. Every night she worked the restaurant, carrying trays heavier than her body wanted to hold. She was used to rude customers. Some complained about the food she didn't cook, others pretended she didn't exist at all. Still, Naomi cooked her smile sharp and her voice soft. She knew dignity was not in what you received, but in how you responded. On that very night, she overheard the words that made her ears sharpen. At the far end of the room, 2 businessmen whispered about a deal worth billions. Their voices carried the excitement of men about to make history. Naomi pretended not to listen, but she couldn't help hearing. She understood enough to know that the restaurant was not hosting just another dinner. It was hosting an empire-shaking decision. She walked past them, balancing plates of roasted lamb and glasses of red wine, her mind racing. If this deal was as big as they made it sound, tonight was not just another night. Tonight was something far more dangerous. And before the night was over, she would be pulled into it in a way she could never have imagined. Clayton Pierce did not just enter the restaurant. He consumed it. The way people turned their heads, the way their room shifted to his orbit, told Naomi this was no ordinary man. Billionaire, industry shark. He had built his empire on buying companies, stripping them bare, and tossing them aside. The kind of man newspapers loved to praise and people in his path quietly hated. Naomi tightened her apron and stepped toward his table. She did what she always did: approach with grace, speak with respect, and let no emotion show on her face. She asked what he would like to drink, her tone even, her posture calm. But Clayton barely looked at her. Instead, he flicked his hand as if brushing away dust. His eyes swept over her as if she were beneath him, less than human. Naomi stood still, holding the notepad in her hand, her voice soft but steady. She asked again, and this time he looked directly at her. His lips curved into a cruel smile. The arrogance in his gaze was sharp enough to pierce steel. His voice carried through the air as he laughed. Around him his investors forced smiles, uncomfortable but unwilling to interrupt him. Naomi forced her breath to stay steady. She remembered her grandmother's words: "Respect yourself, even when no one else will." She scribbled his order quickly, stepping back before her shaking hands betrayed her. Inside, she swallowed the sting of humiliation that he had not even treated her like a person. She moved toward the kitchen, praying for the night to pass quickly. But before she disappeared, Clayton raised his voice, mocking her in front of the entire table. And with that single cruel laugh, Naomi knew this night would not end quietly.
The words fell like a hammer. Illiterate. Clayton's laughter filled the room, bold and shameless, as if Naomi's worth could be decided by his careless tongue. The insult was sharp, public, unforgettable. She froze, holding her tray close to her chest, her eyes fixed on the ground. Her lips trembled, but she refused to let tears fall. She turned, moving quickly toward the kitchen, forcing her feet to keep walking. Her pride bled in silence. Inside the narrow kitchen hallway, she leaned against the wall, her chest rising and falling fast. She told herself to breathe, told herself she had endured worse. But her hands shook and her throat burned with words she dared not say. In her mind, she traveled backward. She saw herself at 20, sitting in a college library, notebooks filled with careful notes. She had once been praised for her sharp memory, her way with words. Professors said she would become an excellent teacher. But dreams did not survive illness bills. Dreams did not pay for pills stacked on a kitchen counter. She returned to the present, wiping her eyes quickly before stepping back into the dining hall. The investors' faces were not smiling anymore. They looked at one another with quiet anger, their patience thinning. Naomi bent to refill glasses at another table, pretending not to notice. But inside, she felt the humiliation throb like a fresh bruise. She whispered to herself that she was not what he called her. She carried the dignity of her grandmother's lessons. She carried the weight of sacrifice, of sleepless nights, of love that kept her standing. One investor slammed his glass down, the sharp crack echoing across the table. Naomi's head snapped toward the sound. The silence that followed was louder than any insult. And in that silence, something far bigger than her pain was beginning to take shape. Chapter 5. Whispers rose like smoke, curling around the edges of the table where Clayton sat. The investors leaned in, their voices sharp but low, their eyes flicking between him and Naomi. She tried to keep her attention on the plates in her hands, but her ears caught the fragments, the doubt, the disapproval, the warning tones. Naomi steadied her breathing, moving gracefully through the room, though her heart still raced. She had been humiliated, but she would not crumble. At another table she poured water, her hands steadier now. She reminded herself of high school when she was valedictorian, when her teachers said she would make something of herself. Those words mattered more than the poison Clayton had spilled. She returned toward the kitchen, her steps quiet, her eyes lowered. She had no idea what those men were deciding, only that their energy had shifted.
They no longer looked at her with pity. They looked at him with disgust. Naomi wiped down a table slowly, her mind drifting to her grandmother. She remembered nights reading by a flickering lamp, her grandmother's voice guiding her through each word. Those memories were proof she was not illiterate, proof she was built from resilience, not arrogance. When she turned again, she noticed one investor watching her closely. He was older, his face stern, but his eyes softened when they met hers. He leaned toward the woman sitting beside him, whispering something that made her nod. Then suddenly, the woman investor raised her hand. "Miss," she called out, her voice firm, her eyes locked on Naomi. The room went quiet once more, the kind of silence that held its breath. Naomi froze in place, every muscle tense. She looked toward the table, unsure why they wanted her. And in that still moment, Naomi realized the night was about to change in a way she could never have prepared for.
What happens when the person everyone expects to be invisible suddenly becomes the center of the room? That's exactly what Naomi Carter felt when the woman investor fixed her eyes on her and called her forward. The air in the restaurant thinned. Even the waiters stopped moving. All eyes turned to Naomi. Her feet carried her, slow and careful, until she stood at the edge of the long, polished table. Clayton leaned back with a smirk, enjoying her discomfort, but the woman investor's gaze was different. It wasn't cruel. It was searching, like someone testing the truth. She asked Naomi who she was, where she came from, what her story was. Naomi hesitated, her hands trembling. She could have lied. She could have brushed it off. But something inside her whispered, "Speak." And so she did. She told them about her grandmother, the woman who raised her when her father left. She spoke of dropping out of college, working endless shifts to pay for medicine. She admitted her dream of becoming a teacher, a dream buried under bills and exhaustion. The room listened, silent and still. For the first time that night, Naomi felt her voice had weight. Clayton's smirk faded slightly as the investors leaned closer, absorbing every word. Naomi's honesty had carved through the noise of money and power, touching something deeper. When she finished, she lowered her eyes, embarrassed by how much she had revealed. But the investors didn't look at her with pity. They looked at her with respect, admiration even. Clayton shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Something was breaking, and it wasn't Naomi. And before Naomi could retreat, the investors exchanged glances and asked her to stay. Clayton Pierce did not like losing control. He tapped his glass against the table, a forced laugh escaping his lips, as if to remind the room who he was. But the investors weren't laughing. Their eyes had shifted from him to Naomi, and in that shift, his empire had begun to crack. One of the investors cleared his throat, challenging Clayton's leadership, questioning whether a man who belittled a stranger in public could be trusted to lead with wisdom. Clayton waved a dismissive hand, brushing off the concern as if it were dust on his sleeve. He called it a joke, a misunderstanding. He claimed they were overreacting. Naomi stood quietly nearby, her heart pounding. She wanted to disappear, yet every word spoken seemed to drag her further into their world. Her chest tightened with fear, but also with something else, power. For the first time, she realized her presence mattered. Her mind drifted back to her teenage years when she worked her first job at a diner. Men with beer-soaked voices had mocked her then, too. She had swallowed her pride, carried their plates, and endured the sting of their laughter. She had been invisible. Tonight, she wasn't invisible anymore.
The investors leaned closer to one another, their faces grave. One of them turned to Naomi and asked her to do something no one expected: to read. They wanted to see for themselves whether Clayton's cruel label held any truth. Naomi's body went cold. They slid a thick contract across the table, the kind filled with words longer than most people ever spoke out loud. And as she stared at the black letters swimming on the page, Naomi realized this was no small request. This was a test she could not afford to fail. The paper in front of Naomi was heavy with meaning. The investors leaned in, their eyes fixed on her hands as she lifted the contract. Her palms were damp, her throat dry. Clayton leaned back with a smirk, enjoying her discomfort. But the woman investor's gaze was different. It wasn't cruel. It was searching, like someone testing the truth. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering her grandmother's voice. She was 7 years old again, tracing letters with her tiny fingers as her grandmother whispered, "Words are doors, Naomi. Learn them, and the world will open." That memory steadied her. She began to read slowly, at first, then stronger. Her voice carried across the table, clear and steady, pronouncing every word with precision. She didn't just read, she explained what the contract meant in plain language, breaking down the legal terms the way a teacher would for her students. The investors sat stunned. They glanced at one another, their brows raising in surprise. Even the waiters nearby froze, listening. Naomi's confidence grew with every sentence. The same girl who had once been mocked in high school for loving books now stood in a room full of billionaires, holding their attention with nothing but her voice. Clayton's smirk collapsed into silence. He fidgeted with his cufflinks, eyes narrowing, rage creeping across his face. Naomi didn't look at him. She finished the last line, placed the contract back on the table, and stood tall. The room erupted, not in applause, but in something sharper. Shock, respect. Quiet murmurs rippled through the investors. They had witnessed something Clayton never expected. Naomi had turned his insult into a moment of undeniable truth. She was not only literate, she was brilliant. And as silence fell again, Clayton realized the power in the room was no longer his.
The investors excused themselves, standing up and moving toward a corner of the restaurant. Their voices lowered, but Naomi could hear fragments, words like arrogance, unfit, and risk. Clayton followed, his face flushed with fury. Naomi stayed where she was, her knees weak, her body buzzing with adrenaline. For the first time in years, she felt proud of herself, not for surviving, but for shining. She whispered silently, remembering her grandmother's words, "Your words are your power." The kitchen doors swung open behind her, releasing a burst of heat and clatter. Naomi almost retreated to safety, but something inside her told her to stay. She had been invisible her whole life. Tonight, the room saw her. The investors' voices grew sharper. Naomi caught enough to understand. They were questioning whether Clayton's leadership was worth a $10 billion risk. He argued back, calling them soft, insisting that his success spoke louder than a single waitress. But success is fragile. It can collapse with one wrong word. Naomi glanced at the table, where untouched glasses of wine reflected the golden lights. A man like Clayton believed he was untouchable. Tonight, he was bleeding power and didn't even know how to stop it. Clayton stormed back to the table, jaw tight, his smile stretched thin like broken glass. He glared at Naomi, as if she had stolen something that belonged to him. His voice rose as he boasted about his empire, about the deals he had crushed before. But the investors didn't look convinced. Their faces were colder now, sharper. The tension in the room felt like thunder before a storm. And in the next breath, Naomi would hear words that would change everything. The thunder finally broke. One of the investors stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His voice cut through the room with finality. They were pulling the deal. $10 billion, gone in an instant. The silence that followed was unbearable. Naomi's chest tightened, her breath shallow. She hadn't caused this, yet she was in the center of it. Clayton's face turned red, veins pulsing at his temples as he barked in disbelief. He demanded explanations. He shouted about loyalty, but the investors did not flinch. They told him the truth. His arrogance, his prejudice, his inability to respect a simple human being had revealed more about his character than any business plan ever could. They said they would not put their money behind a man so reckless, so blind. Naomi stood frozen, clutching her tray like a shield. She wanted to shrink into the shadows, but she also felt a fire rising inside her. For years, she had been told she was small. Tonight, without even trying, she had shifted the fate of an empire. Clayton turned his rage toward her, pointing as if she were the reason for his collapse. His voice spilled like venom, calling her names, blaming her for his downfall. The investors' eyes hardened further, disgust etched across their faces. Naomi's manager appeared in the doorway, eyes wide, unsure whether to step in. The whole restaurant buzzed with whispers now, the fall of a billionaire unfolding in real time. And as Naomi lowered her eyes, one investor rose and said something that made the entire room still again. They announced, with a voice sharp as steel, that Clayton Pierce's reign of untouchable was over. What happens when the mighty fall? The answer came faster than Clayton Pierce could catch it. Within hours of that disastrous dinner, news had slipped from the table to the outside world. By morning, headlines were everywhere. Billionaire CEO humiliates waitress, loses $10 billion deal on the spot. Clayton's face was plastered across every screen, his arrogance replayed in whispers and reports. The empire he had built on power and intimidation began to tremble. Investors pulled out, stocks dropped. His name, once a symbol of strength, became a symbol of shame. Naomi, meanwhile, walked home that night with swollen eyes and a heavy chest. She hadn't asked to be part of this storm, yet somehow she was at the center of it. She finished her shift quietly, tucked her tips in her pocket, and walked past glowing billboards that carried the news of the man who had tried to crush her. She thought of high school again, when kids mocked her for trying too hard. She thought of the library where she once dreamed of being a teacher. That dream flickered inside her like a small flame. Could it be possible still? Her phone buzzed with messages she ignored. She didn't want attention. She didn't want to be the story. All she wanted was peace. But peace never lasts long when storms are breaking empires. The next day at the restaurant, her manager rushed up, out of breath, eyes wide. Someone powerful was waiting in the corner booth. Naomi wiped her hands on her apron, heart racing, unsure what she was about to face. And when she looked across the room, her breath caught in her throat. It was the woman investor, the one who had defended her, motioning for her to come closer.
Naomi's steps felt heavy as she approached the booth. The woman investor sat with perfect posture, a presence so calm it commanded respect. She gestured for Naomi to sit, breaking the boundary between server and guest. Naomi's hand shook as she slid into the seat across from her. The woman spoke with quiet strength. She told Naomi she had been watching, not just that night, but ever since the moment Clayton opened his mouth. She saw dignity in the way Naomi held herself, strength in the way she spoke her truth. Then she did something Naomi could never have expected. She offered her an opportunity. It wasn't just charity, it was an invitation to a new life, a scholarship, mentorship, and guidance to return to school. The woman said people like Naomi deserved doors to open, not close. Naomi blinked fast, fighting the sting of tears. For so long she had carried shame, thinking of herself as someone who had failed. Now, here was a chance to rewrite her story. Still, doubt crept in. What if she failed again? What if she wasn't enough? Her grandmother's face flashed in her mind, wrinkled hands, tired eyes, yet always encouraging. She remembered her grandmother's voice. "Naomi, you are enough. You've always been enough." The woman extended a hand across the table, waiting. Naomi's chest rose and fell, fear and hope battling inside her. Slowly, she reached forward and clasped it, her voice trembling as she accepted. That night, Naomi walked home under the city lights, her steps lighter, her heart uncertain but alive with possibility. For the first time in years, the dream she thought was gone returned to her. And far away, in a penthouse office, Clayton Pierce stared at collapsing numbers on a screen, rage and fear finally cracking his armor. Time passed, but Naomi did not waste it. Months later, she sat in a lecture hall with notebooks open, her pen flying across the page. She was no longer a waitress serving tables. She was a student again, chasing the dream she once buried. Her nights were long. She studied, worked part-time, and volunteered at a small community center. There, she helped children learn to read, their eager faces reminding her of herself as a little girl by the lamp with her grandmother. Each letter, each word felt like healing. Teaching them wasn't just work, it was redemption. Her grandmother, now older and frail, beamed with pride every time Naomi came home with stories of her classes. Naomi had even taught her grandmother to sign her name properly for the first time. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Meanwhile, the world outside kept talking. News outlets followed Clayton's downfall with brutal detail. The man who once stood at the top of the corporate world was filing for bankruptcy. Companies he once crushed were rising while his empire burned. His arrogance had destroyed him faster than any competitor could. Naomi sat at her desk late one evening reading a textbook when her phone lit up. A headline flashed, "Clayton Pierce Empire Collapses." She stared at it, her heart oddly calm. The man who once called her nothing was now being treated like nothing by the world. But she didn't smile. Instead, she whispered to herself, "Let him be a lesson." And then, as if fate had not finished writing, Naomi saw a news alert that made her heart skip. Clayton had been spotted in the city again. Naomi didn't expect to see him, but fate is cruel and curious. One evening, she walked into a cheap diner on the corner near her campus, and there he was, Clayton Pierce, once a billionaire, now hunched over a plate of greasy eggs. His suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, his power gone. For a moment, Naomi froze. She could have walked out. She could have ignored him. But he looked up, and their eyes met. Recognition flickered in his face, shame, regret, and something like desperation. He shifted in his seat, motioning weakly as if inviting her over. Naomi's stomach turned. She remembered that night, his laughter echoing as he called her illiterate. She remembered the burn of humiliation, the sting of tears she fought back. And now here he was, broken, ignored by the world he once ruled. She sat across from him, not out of kindness, but out of strength. His voice cracked as he spoke, softer now, stripped of power. He tried to apologize, saying he had been under pressure, that he didn't mean it, that his words had been a mistake. Naomi listened, her face unreadable. Inside, her heart battled between anger and pity. This was the man who tried to strip her of dignity. This was also a man crushed by his own arrogance. The diner's noise faded around her, the clinking dishes, the buzzing neon lights, all blurred. It was just the two of them, past and present colliding at one small table. Clayton's eyes searched hers, begging for something he had never given anyone, mercy. And Naomi had to decide, would she forgive him or would she walk away? Naomi's silence was louder than any words. She let him speak, let him unravel excuses and regrets, but she saw the truth. This wasn't about her. It was about him. He wanted forgiveness to ease his shame, not because he valued her. When he finally fell quiet, she leaned forward. Her voice was calm, steady, the way her grandmother's voice had always been. She thanked him, not for the insult, but for revealing himself. Because that night, his cruelty had forced her to face the strength she didn't know she had. His words had been meant to break her, but they had built her instead. Clayton lowered his head, unable to respond. Naomi stood, placing a few dollars on the table for her coffee. She didn't look back. She walked out of the diner and into the cool night, her steps strong, her hurt free. Months later, Naomi stood on a stage in a graduation gown. Her grandmother sat in the front row, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. Naomi accepted her diploma with steady hands, the applause thundering around her. The girl once called illiterate became a woman of knowledge, power, and grace. The story could have ended in bitterness, but it ended in fire and light. Naomi understood now. Kindness was strength, empathy was power, and words could build worlds or burn them down. She never saw Clayton again. His name faded from the headlines, his empire forgotten. But Naomi's story lived on, whispered in classrooms, told in homes, shared in corners where dreams still struggled to breathe. And as the crowd rose to its feet, Naomi whispered to herself one last truth. Words once used to break me became the fire that built me.
Stories like Naomi's remind us that power and money mean nothing without respect and kindness. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that uncover the truth, inspire change, and give a voice to the unheard.